Unilever, you never hear of them, but you use their products often. Whether it be a bar of Dove soap or Hellmann's mayonnaise, or even your favorite men's Christmas gift links, Africa. They built their wealth by shaping how economies are globally till this day, including in Africa. But how? How did Unilever become such a global entity quietly and maintain? As you may have seen some controversy with brands within Unilever in Nigeria, but they seem very much detached. They are able to maintain being a global force, a power that has you hooked. But how did it start? The rise. To understand how and where it started, you have to remember that Unilever started in the late 19th century when two separate industries, soap in Britain and margarine in the Netherlands, were reshaping global consumption. In 1885, William Hesketh Lever founded Lever Brothers and launched Sunlight Soap, one of the first branded household products. William Lever wasn't just selling soap. He was building a new economic system based on mass production, advertising, and distribution. This was the very foundation of the wealth Unilever would later become as you know of it today. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, the Jurgens and Van den Berg families were industrializing margarine production after the invention of margarine in 1869. Their companies expanded aggressively across Europe, eventually consolidating into Margarine Uni. Both sides of what would become Unilever were growing rapidly, and both depended on the same essential raw materials, oils and fats. By the early 1900s, global demand for soap and margarine was rising sharply, and supplies of oils and fats were tightening. Lever Brothers responded by securing their own sources. In 1902, they formed Lever Pacific Plantations. In 1911, they established Huileries du Congo Belgique in the Belgian Congo. Lever went to the Congo because the British Colonial Office refused his requests for large land concessions in Nigeria. The Congo became his workaround, a way to secure palm oil when Britain blocked him. But Lever still wanted influence in West Africa. That opportunity came after World War I. In 1920, Lever Brothers purchased the Royal Niger Company, a powerful trading corporation that once held quasi-governmental authority over large parts of what is now Nigeria. The purchase was controversial. Lever paid far more than the company was worth, and critics in Britain argued he had overreached. The deal strained Lever Brothers financially and nearly bankrupted William Lever personally. But strategically, it gave the company deep commercial roots in West Africa, roots that would later anchor Unilever's influence in Nigeria. So, by 1924, the West African Soap Company was incorporated, marking the formal beginning of what would eventually become Unilever Nigeria. This company began manufacturing and distributing soap and other essentials across the region, embedding Lever's products into everyday life. Then came the very decisive moment, 1929. The Niger Company and the African and Eastern Trade Corporation merged to form the United Africa Company, UAC. UAC became one of the most dominant commercial forces in West Africa, controlling shipping, trading, manufacturing, and retail. It shaped prices, supply chains, and economic development across Nigeria, Ghana, and Sierra Leone, long before these regions gained independence. 1 year later, in 1930, Lever Brothers and Margarine Uni merged to form Unilever. The merger was driven by economics. Both companies were competing for the same raw materials, and combining their operations solved the resource conflict while creating one of Europe's largest multinational corporations. Unilever inherited UAC as its West African arm, giving it immediate influence across the region. So you can imagine, throughout the mid-20th century, Unilever expanded its product lines and manufacturing footprint. In Nigeria, the West African Soap Company evolved into a major subsidiary, eventually becoming Unilever Nigeria decades later. Its brands, Lux, Lifebuoy, Lipton, Knorr, became household staples. Blue Band, once part of this portfolio, was sold in 2018. And by 2025, Unilever had spun off its entire ice cream division, including Magnum and Ben & Jerry's, as a separate company. By the late 20th century, Unilever had become a global economic force. Its control of raw materials, manufacturing, distribution, and consumer brands allowed it to shape markets across Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. Its influence in Nigeria, rooted in the 1920 Royal Niger Company purchase and the rise of UAC, remains one of the most significant examples of how a multinational corporation can shape national economies. This is how Unilever started. This is how it built its wealth. And this is how it continues to shape Nigeria and other African and Caribbean economies. But what challenges do you think Unilever faced? Because, as you are probably aware, quiet dominance does not come without its challenges. The challenges. As you can tell, Unilever's path was shaped by a series of economic and geopolitical challenges that forced the company to evolve. The first major challenge came in 1920 when William Hesketh Lever purchased the Royal Niger Company for £8.5 million. It was financed almost entirely through a massive bank loan. So when the post-World War I economy slumped, the value of the company's assets collapsed. William Hesketh Lever's debt burden became so severe that it nearly bankrupted him personally. This financial crisis weakened Lever Brothers at the exact moment it was trying to expand its global footprint. Therefore, as you can probably tell, their next challenge emerged between 1929 and 1930 during the formation of the United Africa Company, UAC, and the merger that created Unilever. The Great Depression hit global trade violently. UAC, formed from the merger of the Niger Company and the African and Eastern Trade Corporation, was losing millions of pounds as commodity prices collapsed. The newly formed Unilever was forced to inject large amounts of capital to prevent UAC from total financial collapse. This early crisis tested the stability of the entire Unilever structure before it had even fully formed. So, from 1939 to 1945, World War II brought destruction on a scale the company had never faced. Unilever's factories in the Netherlands, Belgium, and parts of France were destroyed. Raw materials from Southeast Asia and Africa were cut off as territories fell under occupation. The company lost access to palm oil, coconut oil, and key chemicals. These disruptions forced Unilever to redesign its entire global supply chain, rebuild destroyed facilities, and find new sources of raw materials, all at enormous cost. Which meant in the 1960s, Unilever faced rising resistance across the Caribbean and Africa. In Trinidad and Jamaica, labor strikes intensified during the independence movements, targeting multinational employers like Unilever. At the same time, nationalist pressure grew in Nigeria and Ghana, where governments and labor unions demanded greater local control over foreign companies. These movements challenged Unilever's dominance and forced the company to negotiate new labor, wage, and ownership structures. Then came the 1970s, which brought one of the most significant challenges in Unilever Nigeria's history, the 1972 and 1977 Nigerian Enterprises Promotion Decrees. These laws legally forced foreign companies to sell 60% of their shares to the Nigerian public. Unilever was compelled to restructure its ownership, transfer equity, and localize management, fundamentally changing its position in the Nigerian economy. The ongoing challenges didn't stop, as between 2024 and 2025, Unilever faced a modern corporate crisis. Under the Growth Action Plan, the company cut 7,500 jobs globally and completed the full spin-off of its ice cream division, including Ben & Jerry's and Magnum, into a separate company by late 2025. This breakup reshaped Unilever's identity and narrowed its strategic focus. And now, in 2026, Unilever faces the third oil crisis. Soaring petroleum prices have made fossil fuel-based chemicals too expensive for detergents like Persil and Omo. To protect profit margins, Unilever has been forced to abandon petroleum-derived surfactants and accelerate a shift toward bio-based alternatives. This transition is costly, complex, and reshaping the company's entire supply chain once again. The challenge of owning and maintaining of over 400 brands in beauty and well-being, brands like Dove, Vasu, and Pond's. Personal care, brands like Rexona, Sure/Degree, Lux, and Axe, Lynx. Home care, brands like Persil, Omo, Domestos, and Comfort. Nutrition, brands like Knorr, Hellmann's, and Horlicks. These challenges, whether they be financial, geopolitical, regulatory, and operational, did not weaken Unilever. They hardened it. And they explain how the company continues to shape global economies, build wealth, and influence Nigeria and other African and Caribbean markets today. These challenges, you can tell by now, they led to pivotal turning points throughout Unilever's journey. But what do you think their turning points were? The turning points. Because what you can evidently see, it is clear that Unilever's quiet dominance was shaped by many series of turning points where political pressure, financial risk, and strategic decisions reshaped the company's future. The first major turning point came in 1930, when Lever Brothers and Margarine Uni merged to form Unilever. William Hesketh Lever had died in 1925, so the merger was led by Francis Darcy Cooper, working with the Dutch industrial families of Anton Jurgens and Samuel van den Berg. The merger unified companies generating more than £22 million in annual revenue in 1930, equivalent to around £1.8 billion in 2026, giving Unilever the financial strength to absorb the £3 million to £4 million losses that hit the United Africa Company during the Great Depression, which ultimately led to a second extremely pivotal turning point that happened after World War II, and between 1957 and 1960, when African and Caribbean nations began fighting for independence. In Ghana, Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah pushed for industrialization, while in Nigeria, leaders like Nnamdi Azikiwe and Abubakar Tafawa Balewa encouraged local manufacturing. Unilever responded with major capital expenditure. The Apapa factory in Nigeria cost £1.2 million in 1952, about £40 million today. The Tamar plant in Ghana cost £900,000 in 1957, about £32 million today, and the Kingston facility in Jamaica required £750,000, about £26 million today. These investments reduced import dependence and embedded Unilever into national development plans. This meant that by the 1960s, another turning point emerged as labor movements across the Caribbean demanded economic justice. In Trinidad, union leader George Weeks led strikes that forced multinational employers, including Unilever subsidiaries, to raise wages and expand local employment. These concessions increased annual labor costs by £500,000 to £700,000, about £15 million to £20 million today. In Jamaica, Prime Minister Alexander Bustamante's labor reforms required Unilever to invest £300,000, about £10 million today, in training and local management development. The most decisive turning point came in Africa, Nigeria during the 1970s. While General Yakubu Gowon initiated the first Nigerian Enterprises Promotion Decree in 1972, it was General Olusegun Obasanjo's 1977 decree that, although controversial as you can imagine, this mandate legally forced foreign companies to sell 60% of their shares to Nigerian citizens. At the time, Unilever Nigeria was valued at 45 million Nigerian nairas, which was equivalent to £38.7 million at the 1977 exchange rate, equivalent to roughly £350 million in 2026. This restructuring permanently embedded Unilever into Nigeria's economic system. This move turned Unilever Nigeria into a Nigerian-owned firm for several decades. However, as global markets changed, the parent company, Unilever plc, eventually began buying back some of those shares. By 2017, Unilever plc had increased its stake again to over 60%, meaning it is now back in majority foreign control. So with Unilever back to majority ownership, the next major turning point arrived between 2024 and 2025, when the Growth Action Plan launched by Heinz Schumacher was inherited and accelerated by Fernando Fernandes, who became CEO on March 1st, 2025. Under Fernandes, Unilever completed 7,500 job cuts. This major turning was to save approximately £800 million over 3 years. And what is also worth mentioning is the full separation of its ice cream division, now an independent company generating £7.9 billion in revenue. And if you turn on the news, which you can't turn away from, in March 2026, the third oil crisis, triggered by severe Middle East supply disruptions, has forced a complete chemical transformation. Unilever has fully phased out petroleum-based surfactants in Persil and Omo across its top 10 markets after investing £310 million in bio-based chemistry and supply chain redesign. These turning points explain how Unilever rose, how it built its wealth, and how it still shapes Nigeria and other African and Caribbean economies today. This means they also were very, very strategic. So what strategic steps do you believe they took, and what strategic actions would you have done? The strategies. Because what you can clearly see by now is that Unilever dominance came from multiple deliberate strategies, from financial to political and even operational, that were executed with precision across Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. This meant that the first strategic foundation was laid in the 1930s, immediately after the merger led by Francis Darcy Cooper. Unilever's strategy was simple but powerful: control raw materials at the source. This is why the company doubled down on palm oil plantations in West Africa and expanded UAC's trading networks. By securing supply at a time when global markets were collapsing, Unilever protected its margins and stabilized operations that were generating the equivalent of £1.8 billion in today's value. Therefore, the second strategy step they took after World War II, between 1945 and 1960, when newly independent nations were reshaping their economies. Unilever understood that the future of global manufacturing was shifting toward Africa and the Caribbean, as they saw firsthand just how much these regions are needed to inevitably increase profit margins. So, as you can guess, the company pursued a strategy of local industrial embedding. It invested £1.2 million in the Apapa factory in Nigeria, £900,000 in the Tamar plant in Ghana, and £750,000 in the Kingston facility in Jamaica. These were not symbolic investments, they were strategic footholds. By producing locally, Unilever avoided import tariffs, reduced shipping costs, and aligned itself with national development agendas. This strategy ensured that Unilever became indispensable to the economic infrastructure of these countries. So, by the 1960s, Unilever deployed a third strategy: labor stabilization. As Caribbean labor movements intensified, Unilever realized that political stability was also a financial strategy. In Trinidad, the concessions that increased labor costs by £500,000 to £700,000 annually were not losses. They were investments in uninterrupted production. In Jamaica, the £300,000 invested in training and local management development secured long-term legitimacy and reduced the risk of nationalization. Now, the fourth very interesting strategic steps Unilever took unfolded in Nigeria during the 1970s. When General Olusegun Obasanjo's 1977 decree forced foreign companies to sell 60% of their shares to Nigerians, however, Unilever didn't resist. It adapted. It restructured a business valued at 45 million Nigerian nairas, worth £38.7 million then, £350 million today, and used this localization to secure political protection. And decades later, when global markets shifted, Unilever strategically bought back shares, regaining majority control by 2017. This was long-term strategy, not reaction. Then came the fifth strategic step, which emerged between 2024 and 2025, when Fernando Fernandez became CEO on March 1, 2025. He accelerated the Growth Action Plan, executed 7,500 job cuts, saved €800 million, and completed the spin-off of the ice cream division, now a standalone company generating €7.9 billion in revenue. This sharpened Unilever's focus on high-margin categories. Another key strategy is ensuring mass production and distribution of over 400-plus products within beauty and well-being, brands like Dove, Vasu, and Pond's. Personal care, brands like Rexona, Sure/Degree, Lux, and Axe, Lynx. Home care, brands like Persil, Omo, Domestos, and Comfort. Nutrition, brands like Knorr, Hellmann's, and Horlicks. And now, in March 2026, Unilever's strategy is chemical independence. The third oil crisis forced the company to invest £310 million to fully transition Persil and Omo to bio-based surfactants across its top 10 markets. This protects margins, stabilizes supply chains, and positions Unilever as a global sustainability leader. These strategies explain how Unilever rose, how it built its wealth, and how it still shapes Nigeria and other African and Caribbean economies today. What strategic move do you think gave them the biggest long-term advantage? And what lessons have you learned so far? But wait, before you decide on what lessons you have learned so far, let's do a quick recap. As long way before Unilever even existed, is that William Hesketh Lever's decisions in the 1890s revealed the mindset that would define the company for over a century. William Hesketh Lever believed that the only way to build a global business was to control the essentials behind it. That's why, in 1897, he pushed aggressively into West Africa to secure palm oil at the source. It wasn't just business, it was a belief that whoever controlled raw materials controlled the future. That instinct shaped every decision that followed. It also helped that West Africa was unfortunately under colonialism. Then came Francis Darcy Cooper. William Hesketh Lever's successor, led the 1930 merger between Lever Brothers and Margarine Uni to form what you now know as Unilever. So the deep lesson is about timing. The world was collapsing into the Great Depression, and companies generating £22 million in revenue needed protection. The insight here is that the strongest players don't wait for stability, they create it. Consolidation became a psychological shield against uncertainty. The next lesson is that after World War II, between 1945 and 1960, Unilever's expansion grew further in Ghana, Nigeria, and the Caribbean countries revealed another truth. Proximity builds power. Investing £1.2 million in Nigeria, £900,000 in Ghana, and £750,000 in Jamaica wasn't just industrial strategy. It was a recognition that influence grows fastest when you become part of a nation's economic fabric. The lesson is that wealth compounds where presence and dependency overlap, and pure intentional. Then, by the 1960s, as labor movements intensified across Trinidad and Jamaica, Unilever learned that stability has a price. Paying an extra £500,000 to £700,000 in labor costs wasn't a setback. It was the cost of uninterrupted production. The insight is that control is rarely about force. It's about knowing when to concede, when to hold, and when to attack. That's how you win. Then came Nigeria in the 1970s. When General Olusegun Obasanjo's 1977 decree forced Unilever to sell 60% of its shares, the company adapted instead of resisting. A business valued at 45 million Nigerian nairas, worth £38.7 million then and £350 million today, was restructured to secure long-term survival. And decades later, by regaining majority control in 2017, Unilever proved that patience is a strategy, not a virtue. And now, in March 2026, the third oil crisis shows the final insight. The companies that endure are the ones that evolve. Investing £310 million to shift Persil and Omo to bio-based surfactants wasn't innovation, it was inevitability. Which of these lessons do you think defines Unilever's identity the most? And, most importantly, which will you apply for yourself and your business? When you look back at Unilever's story, it's almost impossible not to feel the weight of how far this story stretches. Especially if you are African or from the Caribbean, and especially if you are born and raised in the diaspora. As Unilever begins quietly in the 1890s, with William Hesketh Lever standing in a world where colonial empires were expanding in Africa and Caribbean regions where there once was empires of their own. And sadly, it was under colonial rule centuries later. In 1897, when he pushed into the region to secure palm oil, he wasn't just building a business. He was stepping into a continent whose resources were being stolen for the benefit of building and maintaining colonizers. The irony is that this single decision, made thousands of miles from London, would shape global economies for more than a century. Then, the world shifted again. By 1930, as the Great Depression tightened its grip, Francis Darcy Cooper brought Lever Brothers Limited and Margarine Uni together. Two companies generating £22 million in revenue were suddenly fighting for survival. The merger wasn't just triumph for them, it was a necessity. Yet from that pressure came the birth of Unilever, a company that would soon weave itself into the lives of millions. After World War II, between 1945 and 1960, the emotional landscape changed once more. Ghana moved toward independence in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, and other African and Caribbean countries were fighting for independence from colonial rule. So you can imagine that Unilever had to start building factories in Apapa, Nigeria for £1.2 million, Tema, Ghana for £900,000, and Kingston, Jamaica for £750,000. These weren't just industrial sites. They became symbols of how deeply a foreign company could root itself into national economies. For many, it was an opportunity. For others, dependency. For Unilever, it was both. As you can see, they felt the need to plant themselves where they knew they would continue to benefit despite the shift in leadership in those countries. By the 1960s, the tension rose again. In Trinidad, George Weeks led strikes that forced Unilever to pay an extra £500,000 to £700,000 a year. In Jamaica, £300,000 went into training and local management. These were moments where power was challenged, where workers demanded dignity, and where Unilever learned that influence is never guaranteed. After all slavery and colonialism ended, imagine how you would feel if you were the workers. You never asked for them to come to your country. You didn't even ask for your family and friends to be under colonial rule to be mistreated. Before they came, they had their own livelihood, and this was disrupted out of pure greed and arrogance. Then came the turning point that still echoes today in Nigeria, as in 1977, General Olusegun Obasanjo decree forced Unilever to sell 60% of its shares. A business worth 45 million Nigerian nairas, £38.7 million, then £350 million today, was no longer theirs to control. Yet decades later, by 2017, Unilever quietly regained majority ownership. A full-circle moment built on patience, strategy, and time. So it makes you wonder, how did Nigeria lose such power and control? And do you think this is a lesson for every single foreign business in African and Caribbean countries? And now, in March 2026, the third oil crisis forces another transformation. £310 million poured into bio-based surfactants. A company once built on palm oil now rewriting its chemistry to survive. When you deep it, their journey has been quite an intriguing journey. As Unilever had the foresight to overcome potential problems, and that is why they sustained for decades. But it also comes at an emotional cost for Africans and Caribbeans in those countries, as well as in the diaspora, as it has had a knock-on effect whereby some had to migrate from those countries to, ironically, the countries that their country was once under colonial rule. So as you can tell, this is not just a story about the rise of Unilever, nor is it just a story about how they built their wealth. And it's not just a story about how Unilever still shapes Nigeria and other African and Caribbean economies today. It's a story of the emotional weight of everyone involved, and that also includes you. With all that said, what are the hardest lessons you have learned from Unilever, and what is the principle of their story? The principle, as when you trace this entire story from the beginning, the principle that emerges is not loud. It's steady, shaped by decisions made across continents and across time. It begins in the 1890s, when William Hesketh Lever moved into the palm oil-rich regions of the Niger Delta, the Cross River Basin, Lagos Colony, and the wider coastal belt that today forms Nigeria, Cameroon, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. In 1897, he secured palm oil directly from these regions, not because they were weak, but because they held resources that till this day global industries need. The imbalance came from who controlled the systems around those resources, not from the value of the regions themselves. You see it every day. It is about power and control, and in business, profit margins often means something has to give in order to gain. So, as you know, by 1930, when Francis Darcy Cooper merged Lever Brothers Limited with Margarine Uni, forming Unilever during the Great Depression, the principle sharpened. Global power favors those who build structures before crises arrive. Two companies generating £22 million in revenue didn't merge out of convenience. They merged because they understood that survival requires architecture, not hope. They learned to adapt, to expand, and maintain their influence. They saw an opening, not a closing. Even between 1945 and 1960, as Ghana moved toward independence in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, and Caribbean nations pushed for sovereignty, Unilever invested £1.2 million in Apapa, Nigeria, £900,000 in Tema, and £750,000 in Kingston, Jamaica. These decisions show that influence grows where presence becomes infrastructure. But at the same time, Africans and Caribbeans were building nations, institutions, and identities, laying foundations that would shape their own futures. Both forces moved in parallel, one through capital, the other through transformation. Then, by the 1960s, when Trinidad's George Weeks led strikes that raised labor costs by £500,000 to £700,000, and Jamaica secured £300,000 in training investment. The principle evolved again. Power shifts when people organize. Influence is never fixed. It responds to pressure, unity, and timing. Then came Nigeria, 1977. General Olusegun Obasanjo's decree forcing Unilever to sell 60% of its shares showed that nations can reclaim control when they choose to. Keywords: don't let that fly over your head. So you can see there are no excuses. And when Unilever regained majority ownership by 2017, it showed that long-term strategy can outlast political cycles. Both sides demonstrated agency, just expressed differently. Again, you can see how it was obvious that Unilever found yet another opening. They played the long game. You can speculate on whether they played a role in political instability to gain, but either way, they played the long game. And now, in March 2026, with £310 million invested into bio-based surfactants during the third oil crisis, the final principle becomes clear. The world belongs to those who adapt faster than the forces reshaping it. And, till this day, Unilever is responsible for over 400+ brands within the following. 1. Beauty and well-being. Brands like Dove, Vasu, and Pond's. 2. Personal care. Brands like Rexona, Sure/Degree, Lux, and Axe. Lynx. 3. Home care. Brands like Persil, Omo, Domestos, and Comfort. 4. Nutrition. Brands like Knorr, Hellmann's, and Horlicks. So the real takeaway is this. The regions that are still supplying the world can build for themselves now. The lesson isn't to repeat Unilever's path. It's to understand the architecture behind it, then design something built on your own terms, with your own ownership and your own scale. Take the opportunity. Why do you think Aliko Dangote built Dangote Group? It wasn't by accident. He saw something similar to what William Hesketh Lever saw in West Africa regions. You, too, can continue to build and scale. Don't be scared by politics, and don't be consumed by it either. Demand more of yourself and brand to the point. No matter the economic or political climate, you and your brand wins for decades. Therefore, you too can rise, grow your wealth, and still shape regions that you aim your organization to be in, just like Unilever. So,